You're muted.
Thank you for that. Right, it would have gone on for a while before I realized that. All right, so just a reminder, I'm recording the session, and I'm always going to attach it as a YouTube link to whatever the post is for today. So that today we're doing lesson 3 tables of ratios, and you're going to find a YouTube link here sometime after class today. All right, so if you go over to content, just to give you guys a brief overview of the curriculum, what we're looking at so far, we should have done already the first lesson, that mastery test, the second lesson, that mastery test. So today we're working on lesson 3, which is tables of ratios. We're doing the lesson today, and then tomorrow you're gonna get to that mastery test. Right, when I was going through yesterday, I messaged a couple of people in Edmentum. So just try to make sure that you're looking. I'm not sure how it looks on your end, but for me, I have a little kind of envelope at the top of my screen. Again, yours looks a little bit different, but somewhere you should see messages. Just try to look out in case I happen to send you a message. So I saw some people that had maybe tests that were locked. They attempted it, they needed to attempt it again. So if I unlocked something for you, I sent you a message, right? Just to let you know. If you get my messages, just please reply to them so that I do know that you actually got to me. You just say, okay, thanks, just anything so that I know that you actually received the message, okay? And again, best way to message me if you actually have a question, you want me to unlock something, is with my email. Because I do see like this notification here, but I'm not always gonna get like a sound or an alert that I have that message. And it's sometimes hard to see if I'm not looking all the way at the top up there. All right, just give me a second, I'm looking at the chat, okay, good. All right, so what we're doing today is we're looking at tables of ratios. So remember, so far we looked at ratios, which is just a comparison between two quantities. We talked about rates. Remember, rates is just like a ratio, but you have different types of quantities that you're comparing. So different examples of rates, we said were like miles per hour, maybe dollars per hour. Those are rates, and those specifically are unit rates because it's per one thing, right? Per 1 hour, per 1 mile, something like that, all right? So these lessons always start off with an objective. That's telling you what's the goal of what you want to be able to do by the end of these 20 slides, right? So the objective for today is that in this lesson, you will make tables of equivalent ratios and also use them to compare ratios, right? So let's just get right into it. All right, let's read through this scenario. It says, Roger's father visits an electronics superstore to check out cell phone plans from different telephone companies. Out of curiosity, Roger tags along with his father. Roger's father narrows his choice down to 2 companies, Dial It Up and Ring Ring, right? So pretty cheesy names. It says Dial It Up sells data plans at, this looks like important information, $16 for 2 gigabytes. Right, so let's just highlight that. Again, this is also something you can do yourself as you're reading. You can use that highlighter tool to keep track of things. Next, it says Ring Ring sells data plans for $9 for 1 gigabyte. Right, now I know most people these days are probably getting unlimited data, but there was a time where people had to pay per gigabyte. People still do that right now. So it's not that far removed, right? It says, and now these two look different, right? $16 for 2, $9 for 1. So looking at it at first, if you don't have a good idea, good concept with the math, it might be hard to figure out which of those is actually a better deal, because this is comparing 2 gigabytes to 1 gigabyte, right? But hopefully some people here already kind of can get the idea of which one here is going to be the better deal. And it says that Roger's father finally decides that Dial It Up, right? So Dial It Up was the first one here, $16 for 2 gigabytes. That's the one that he went with. He thinks that that's a better deal. So he got that for 4 gigabytes, right? So we could do a little bit of math to figure out how much he's going to pay and how many gigabytes that is going to give him, right? So basically, to understand this concept, right, we're dealing with rates here and ratios because we're comparing money to gigabytes, 2 different things. So that's a rate. The first one is just a regular rate. The second one, this is a unit rate because it's $9 to 1 gigabyte. Remember, when we compare to one thing, that makes it a unit rate. So to help figure out situations like this on why one plan might be better than the other, we're going to start looking at ratio tables today to help us do that. All So when you're trying to compare ratios to figure out which one is better than another, something that's useful to use is a ratio table, right? So what we're going to do first is we're going to start off by just looking at a regular ratio. So let's say we're talking about a car that's driving and the car gets 20 miles to 1 gallon of gas, right? So you go to the gas station, you pump 1 gallon of gas into the car, and you're able to drive for 20 miles. That's what that means, right? So what we can do is we can build and we can use a ratio rate table to figure out how much mileage we'll get out of different amounts of gasoline, right? So the way that this works here is actually extremely simple. You basically just take the initial ratio that you started off with. So this 20 miles to 1 gallon, that ends up going in the first row in my rate table. Now, basically I just think about adding this up. So I'd say, okay, so let's say I went for one more, I added 1 more gallon, right? So if I add 1 more gallon of gas, that means that I'm gonna actually be able to go 20 more miles. So every time I move downward, I'm just increasing by whatever my ratio was. Same thing here. If I want to go from 2 gallons up to 3 gallons, I'm adding 1 more gallon. So every time I add 1 gallon, I'm able to go 20 more miles. So now 40 plus 20 gets me to 60 miles, right? Another way that you can think about it, instead of adding up, is also multiplying. So if you wanted to try and say jump around and instead go straight from, 1 second, just adding some people in. If I wanted to go straight from, say, 1 gallon of gas up to 5 gallons of gas, what I could do is I could keep adding until I got to 5. But a fast way to do it, and similar to right, thank you, Priscilla, for muting yourself. If I'm going up from 1 gallon of gas up to 5 gallons of gas, and I'm skipping some numbers, I can say, okay, so to get from 1 to 5, I just have to multiply by 5. So I would have to do the same thing on this end. To get from 20 gallons, I need to multiply that number by 5, and that does indeed get me up to 100 gallons of gas. Right? So that's kind of how this ratio table works. You can think about adding as you move up the table, or also you can think about multiplying by whatever number gets you to the number farther down the table. Any questions before I go on to the next piece? Okay, please let me know if you have questions. That's the only way that I can know if I need to go over something again. All right, so next thing is just going to show us a different example, okay? So you just skip after the. No, okay, so that example there, it doesn't tell you to skip. I was just showing you that you can skip, right? So I could keep adding by 1, right? I could say, okay, I can add by 1 again, add by 1. I can say I wanted to go up from 5 to 6. Again, I add 1 over here. Again, I'd add 20 here, so 6 would be 120. But let's say that my car holds, like 13 gallons of gas. That's how many gallons my car holds about. So if I wanted to go all the way up to the number 13, sure, I could keep going up. I could say, okay, so go from 6 to 7 plus 1, 7 to 8 plus 1, adding 1, and same thing on the left-hand side. I could keep adding 20, keep adding 20 until I get down to this row here. But a faster way to do that would be, let's just work from 1. So to get from 1 gallon of gas all the way down to 13, I just need to multiply by 13. And then likewise, I would do the same thing on the left-hand side. Okay, so 20 gallons of gas, 20 miles multiplied by 13 is going to give me how many miles I will get out of those 13 gallons. Right? Does that make a little bit more sense? Okay, good. Give me a second, just adding people as we show up. All right, Now, other thing here I forgot to mention is that these ratios are also all equivalent, right? Which means that they're all actually going to boil down to this ratio of 20 to 1. So if I was to look at like the ratio of say 80 to 4, right? Remember that first lesson we talked about ratios being equivalent. So I would say, okay, so 80 to 4 is really like saying, okay, I know 80 is 20 times 4. I know that 4 is just like 4 times 1 when we talk about factors. So this is a factor of 4, this is a factor of 4. This is really the same thing as the ratio 20 to 1. Or I can just think about dividing. 40 divided by 80, because remember, these are also work as fractions. 80, over 4 is just equal to, they're the same thing. Every single one of these. If I look at, say, 100 over 5, 5 goes into 100 20 times. So this also simplifies down to the fraction or the ratio 20 over. So all of these here, this is like a ratio, 100 to 5, 80 to 4, 60 to 3. These all actually are just equal to that same ratio because all we're doing is we're scaling it upwards. And we're going to see some more examples like this later on. All right. So let's look at this example here. It says the table shows the number of miles Ken's car can travel and the number of gallons of gas that's used to travel that distance. What's the equivalent ratio, right? So when I look back at this one here, I figured out, okay, all of these here can simplify to the ratio 20 to 1. So same idea here is that all of these ratios can simplify down to something else. So does anybody think they have an idea of what the equivalent ratio is? How can I simplify these? A good thing to start with is just to pick one. So let's say I pick the top one here. So that's the ratio 30 to 2, or we really kind of think about them as fractions. So that's like the fraction 30 over 2 or 30 divided by 2. Does anybody know how I could go ahead and simplify that fraction? I'm just going to pull up the chat in case I hear anybody say it in here. Okay. So just remember, when we simplify these fractions, we're trying to think about finding common factors. So really something else that you can just do is you can divide in most cases. So 30 over 2, another way to read that is 30 divided by 2. So if I do 30 divided by 2, we end up with 15, right? 15 I can write as a fraction as just 15 over 1, right? So in other words, what we kind of did here is we said, okay, so I know that 30 is just equal to 15 times 2. 2 is just 2 times 1. I'm finding factors, and I cancel off the factors in the top and the bottom. So I'm left with just that 15 over 1. But if you just divide the bottom into the top, you just put it over 1 in the end. So 15 over 1 is actually my ratio, which I can express like this here, 15 colon. And again, that works with anything here. If I tried it with this one here as well, right? 60 over 4. Remember, this means 60 divided by 4. So if you do that in your calculator, again, you're going to get 15. So it's 15 over 1 is what my ratio would be. Again, same thing, 15 over 1. It works with this one. It works with this one. Anytime you're looking at a ratio table, when you divide one number by the other, you should always get that same number. It's always going to bring you back to that common equivalent ratio that they all share, right? And the reason why is because, right, let's say I started with this one, 15 over 1. If this here in the bottom is a 4, I say, okay, how do I get that? I want to multiply the bottom by 4, multiply the top by 4. 15 times 4 gets me to 60. 1 times 4 gets me to 4. So that's the ratio, 60 over 4, which I have right here. I'll just pause for a second in case anybody has any questions there. Again, try to follow along with me as well in Edmentum. So, okay, good question. Why times 4? So, times 4 because I said, I was kind of basically just trying to check my answer. So I said, if this is the ratio that I have, right? I know it's 15 miles to 1 gallon. That's what I figured out. If I wanted to get to this one right here, if I wanted to say, okay, how do I get to 60 over 4? So that's kind of testing if the two are equivalent or not. So the question is, how would I go from this one to this one here? So usually you look at the smaller numbers first. So I'd say, okay, so how do I get from 1 to 4? And you're always going to multiply in these cases. So I get from 1 to 4 really easily by just multiplying by 4, right? 1 times 4 gets me 4. So if I multiply the bottom by something, I also have to multiply the top by the same number. So I need to do 15 times 4, which in fact does give you 60. So these two are equivalent, right? If though I happen to like show you something like this, right? Let's say I said, okay, so this one here, 15 over 1, is that equivalent to the ratio, say, 70 over 5? Are these two equivalent? So I'd say, okay, how do I get from 1 to 5? I'd say multiply the 1 times 5. Now I need to do the same thing to the top. So I'd say 15 times 5. Does that give me 70? No, that would actually give me 75, right? So this here would not be an equivalent ratio, right? As I can see over here, it would need to be 75 over 5 to get me that equivalent ratio. Right, 70 in this case represents the distance, 5 represents the gas. Right, so now it's going to give us an example, and we kind of went over this already, so hopefully we know how to do this without looking at it, but let's just read the context. It says, Matt's roommate Zach owns a car that gets 10 miles per gallon. In the table's empty cells, we need to fill in the number of miles for each number of gallons. So if we give his car 1 gallon of gas, it can go 10 miles. So if we now instead give his car 2 gallons of gas, how much do I need to increase the miles by? No, I'll try to walk you through getting into Edmentum after I finish with the session, okay? So just follow along. So anytime we increase, right, this here tells us what to do. For every 1 gallon of gas, so right now I'm adding 1 gallon of gas, I need to increase by 10 miles. Which number are you referring to, Anthony? So I need to add 10 more. So this one would be 20, right? And then I would say, okay, now I'm going from 2 gallons of gas up, adding 1 more gallon. So every time I add 1 gallon of gas, my car is going to go an extra 10 miles. So now I'm going from 20 miles up to 30 miles. So that's one way to do it. You can keep adding by 1 on the right-hand side, adding by 10 on the left-hand side. But just to show you the other way to do it, because there are 2 ways that you can do it, is you can also do it by multiplication. So I can say, okay, so if I'm going from 1 gallon up to 4 gallons, right? I quadrupled the amount of gas. So I multiply the amount of gas by 4. That means I'm going to quadruple how far I can go. So I'm going to multiply the 10 by 4. So 10 multiplied by 4 gets me to 40. And you can see that you would end up with the same result if instead of multiplying, you were to just add. So if I said, okay, 30 plus 10, that gets me to 40. Right, so the plus 10 is easier for a small table like this, right? But what tends to happen when you get to like higher level math classes is I'm not always gonna be interested in stuff that's just in order, right? The question might show you something like this and then say, okay, so let's say that you gave the car something like 53 gallons of gas. How far are you going to be able to go with those 53 gallons, right? So obviously this approach would work. You could say, okay, so plus 1, plus 1, plus 1, plus 1, right? But you're going to have to keep adding that 53 times. And nobody has the time to do that. I know I don't. I'm sure you guys don't either. So in that case, once you get to those higher numbers, you would just say, okay, instead of wasting my time adding and adding and adding and adding, remember, multiplication is repeated addition. That's how it's defined. So in a big case like that, it's a lot easier to say, okay, so all I'm doing from 1 to 53 is multiplying by 53. So I would take my initial 10 miles, multiply that by 53 as well, and say, okay, 10 times 53 is just 530, right? That's going to be a whole lot faster than if instead we sat there and said, okay, so I'm at 40 now, plus 10, right? Plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, right? I can't even fill all those out here. That's going to take way too much time, but really quickly, if you understand how the math works, it's really easy to just multiply that instead, right? So the adding is fine with these smaller tables, up to like, you know, around 10 or so. It's also if you have the patience for it, you want to sit down and do it out, you can always do that. But eventually in math, you want to work more towards doing it with the multiplication, right? If you feel comfortable doing it with adding, that's definitely fine for now. Right? Just kind of giving you guys an example of how it's going to work in the future. All right, so this here, in case you didn't get the way that I explained it, is really, again, just gonna kind of go ahead and explain how that works. And you can see here, they're showing you the multiplication method. So 10 multiplied by 2 gets you to 20, right? The multiplication always works. The adding is also gonna work as well. Right, and still, this is them still explaining that. So let's see, one more example, right? Now we're looking at one here that's not a unit rate, right? So I can see that we're comparing 3 cartons. Give me a local answer. Bring it here. Sorry, guys, 1 second. Penelope, bring the phone over here. So 3 cartons of orange juice costs $2. So it's not a unit rate, but it is a rate. Here, take it over there. Right? So the problem actually says that Laura wants to buy 9 cartons of fruit juice, right? But she wants to figure out how much it's going to cost if this here is how much it costs, $2 for every 3 cartons. So one way that we can figure that out is by using a rate table, right? So if you were doing this by paper, first thing that you would do is just set up your table. So cartons goes on one side. All right, Penelope, take it over there, please. Penelope, take the phone over there, please. Daddy's working. Sorry, guys. All right, so number of cartons is on one side, and the amount of money is on the right-hand side that it's going to cost, right? It doesn't matter the order that you keep it as long as you keep the numbers in the right place, right? If I wrote number of cartons, and then I put a 2 here, dollars, and put a 3, now I'm going to get the wrong answer. So just make sure that you're matching up your units with the correct numbers, right? Then all I need to do is the same exact thing that we did before. So we can do it by adding, or we can do it by multiplying, right? So this tells me here that for every $2 that you spend, you're gonna get 3 cartons. So in this case here, I'm not going to increase by 1, I'm actually gonna be increasing by 2, since that's my ratio. My ratio is 3 to 2. So every time I increase by $2, now I'm at $4, I'm gonna increase 3 cartons. So the top row tells you how much you're increasing by. So That gets me to 6 cartons, costs $4. And then if I want to add on another $2, spend another $2. So if I spend $6 altogether, that means that I'm able to buy 3 more cartons. So now I'm at 9 cartons, which again, right, that was our goal. So it looks like if it wants to get 9 cartons, it's going to end up costing $6, right? So again, this top row here is your equivalent ratio. That's telling you how to fill out this table, right? The most important information is always going to be right at the top. Just working, continuing this out for the rest, right? One more time, I'd say, okay, so another plus $2 gets me to 8. Over here, if I add on 3 more, that gets me to 12. Right? Does that kind of make a little bit of sense? And now the way that it works, if I instead wanted to do it by multiplying, I think about how many columns am I up to. So if I wanted to go from here down to here, right? I'd say, okay, so this is like doing it once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. This would be like buying this discounted carton 5 times. So $2 times 5 gets me to 10. And again, I'd multiply by 5 on this side here. 5 times 3 would get me to 15 cartons for $10, right? Again, the adding approach doesn't work. The multiplying approach also works, right? Just 2 different ways for you to go about answering the same question. Good, I'm seeing people saying that they got it. Just go ahead and give me that feedback if you can. If you're getting it, let me know. If you're not getting it, you want me to try to explain it differently, let me know that as well. Right, so again, this here is just going over what we just did. So in case you want to go over it yourself and see what they did, you can look at those there. All right, so that's pretty much it for the lesson for today. So we've got still about 15 minutes of class left. I'm going to stick around here. I'm going to read you through just the top section to help get you started, and then I'll stick around in case anybody has any questions stuff before you just finish working on it. Okay? So just remember the first part, it's always the same. It's just kind of telling you what you're learning, why you're learning it. The directions are down here, right? So it says, this activity, you will figure out how Roger's father decided whether dial it up or Ring Ring has a better data plan. You will also compare the text to all plans that these companies offer and decide which option is the best, right? So basically just kind of read through this. Remember, this is the scenario from the beginning, $16 for 2 gigabytes or $9 for 1 gigabyte. Read through these here, answer the questions that you see. It's going to ask you to fill in some of these tables. So look at what we did before. Again, I'm going to stick around for the first 15 minutes. So try to answer as much of this you can and let me know if you have questions on it. All right, I'm going to end the recording.